If you want to support independent content like this show, the PlayStation Podcast Sacred Symbols, the Retro Podcast Knockback, and more, and get perks for doing so, please consider subscribing to Colin's Last Stand on Patreon at patreon.com/Colin's Last Stand. Your support is essential. Thank you. Once known for publishing some of the most prolific series in gaming, perhaps no other company is as paradoxically beloved and hated by gamers quite like Konami. Due to a history of odd and sometimes vindictive business decisions, their popularity has stumbled in more directions than the infamous cheat code for which they are known, though it's fair to say that their last blunder was so bad that in most players' eyes, the once respected publisher may never actually recover. But the question is, after releasing some of the biggest titles throughout video gaming's 5-decade and counting run, how did a company with a library of hits burn all of its bridges within the community at large? Well, to get to the ending, we have to begin at the start, so today I present to you, as voted upon by Colin's Last Stand's patrons, a brief history of Konami.
But enough talk! How about you?
Originally founded on March 21st, 1969 as a jukebox retail and repair shop, Konami was brought to life by Kogamasa Kazuki, though the name Konami Industry Co. wouldn't be established until the spring of 1973. It was during that year that the company began manufacturing arcade machines. Just one trip around the sun later, and their initial capital investment of 1 million yen had increased fourfold. And throughout the rest of the 70s, Kogamasa would find continued success as his company's value continued to grow, closing out the decade with a value of a cool 40 million yen. During the middle of the 70s, Konami also began creating their own games instead of merely manufacturing machines. Their first one appears to have been a maze game in 1976 called, simply enough, Maze, though very little information remains about it. It ultimately wouldn't be until the final 2 years of the decade that they began to really dive into publishing their own titles. During those years, they released a handful of games, one of these being Space King. This was essentially a Space Invaders clone, as the objective was to move a tank left or right along the bottom of the screen as the player shot waves of invading aliens. Between 1978 and 1980, Konami released other now hard-to-find games such as Block Game, MISSILEX, ASTRO Invader, Space War, and a handful of others. However, it was in 1981 that they really hit the commercial and critical mark with the release of Frogger, easily their most famous game up to that point. The iconic Frogger is no doubt largely recognized by gamers and non-gamers alike. Featuring a frog who needs to cross dangerous streets and rivers, the gameplay of Frogger is simple yet addictive. It was also technologically advanced for its time, as it was one of the first games to use 2 CPUs. While certainly not as instantly recognizable to younger players today, another 1981 title developed by the Japanese company was Scramble, and later its sequel, Super Cobra. The former was the first multi-level side-scrolling shooter, a genre that would go on to define quite a few massive Konami hits as the years wore on. Out of their side-scrolling shooters, a subgenre of the game known commonly as shoot-'em-ups, perhaps no Konami spaceship shooty flying game was as popular as Gradius. In that game, which has been retroactively hailed as a sequel to Scramble, the player pilots a, you guessed it, spaceship as they blast their way through seemingly endless waves of enemies and obstacles. Known for its difficulty, the title would go on to become a notable success, as well as become a launching point for the numbered sequels and spin-off titles that followed, spin-offs that included Salamander, or as it's known in the United States, Life Force. An important feature of Gradius's later NES port is that it contains the first ever use of the now famous Konami code. The cheat was spawned into existence by Kazuhisa Hashimoto, a game developer working on the NES port, because as he would explain it in 2003, he hadn't played the game much and couldn't beat it himself. Since that origin, it's grown to be included in not just a ton of Konami games, but other publishers' titles as well, and it's even left its mark on popular culture, as non-game related corporations like to use it as an Easter egg on their websites. While its first use was in Gradius, the cheat was largely popularized by the notoriously difficult run-and-gun game on the NES known as Contra. As any child of the 80s and 90s can attest, cheating was practically required to finish the experience. This was long before the internet would just scream at them to get good. On the business side of things, Konami was growing at a steady pace. It was during 1981 that they finally established a logo, a move that wisely coincided with the founding of Konami of America that following year. Further fueling Konami's growth were their well-timed moves not only into the nascent PC gaming market, but the console market as well. All were steps which helped their already successful games sell even better. However, by 1986, their original logo was looking dull, and with the decision to rebrand, they created the more iconic symbol that would remain in use until 2003. As the 80s were winding down, Konami was quickly becoming a force to be reckoned with. With a collection of hits now under its belt, the publisher/developer's library was quite impressive. Games like Q*bert, Blades of Steel, Track and Field, Yi Kung Fu, Salamander, WEC Le Mans, Quarth, and a handful of others all enjoyed various levels of critical and commercial success. The company's releases were becoming versatile and attractive to larger swaths of players. Publishing games that covered all types of genres, be it sports, platformers, fixed shooters, arcade fighters, run and guns, vehicular combat, racing, and a bevy of others, Konami seemed determined to have something for everyone. Impressive still was that even its biggest hits covered a wide range. And let me tell you, they churned out some massive hits. Releasing at different times during the back half of the 80s, the Japanese publisher put out Contra, Metal Gear, and Castlevania, 3 games that are absolutely revered worldwide, and which would go on to spawn a collection of sequels, spin-offs, and sub-franchises. As the company moved into the 90s, they continued making not only original IPs, but games for licensed properties as well. The Goonies, a Famicom exclusive game released in Japan in 1986, sold nearly 1 million copies, making it easy to assume that the company quickly learned how profitable licensing can be. Stateside, it was Konami's various releases of Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles that left its mark on the American crowd. You'd be hard-pressed to find a gaming enthusiast over the age of 25 who lacks fond memories of the TMNT side-scrolling beat-em-ups. Though that wasn't all, as Konami would go on to release well-received games based off The Simpsons, X-Men, Aliens, Batman, and quite a few other lucrative franchises. That doesn't mean all was well and good, however, as the company still pushed out a lot of licensed games that were mediocre at best and downright terrible at worst. More forgettable fare like Mission Impossible, Top Gun, Tiny Toon Adventures, Lord of the Rings, and even Plan 9 from Outer Space, a game that in some cases hilariously included a VHS tape for the abysmal movie upon which it was based. Outside of video games, Konami was beginning to make headway into other ventures that would help them become the behemoth they are today, with an estimated net worth of $3.5 billion. One step towards getting there was when they entered the Pacha-slot and pachinko businesses in 1992. In the modern day, this is a sort of subtextual code to gamers who still have nightmares of erotic violence and screams to hit the lever, as such machines have made laughable attempts to cash in on popular Konami franchises like Metal Gear Solid and Castlevania. But from a strictly corporate point of view, the pachinko business has been and continues to be very good to the company. Their jump into gambling isn't exclusive to Japan either, as one walk through almost any American casino will reveal the Konami logo floating in the hazy smoke and lights of any slot machine section. Which makes sense given that they have their own production facilities within Nevada, the most recent of which was built in 2015. Other ventures that have brought Konami success is their headlong dive into trading card games in 1999 when they developed and published Yu-Gi-Oh! This move was so successful that 10 years later, Guinness gave them a world record for having the top-selling card game. In 2013, they'd set yet another world record. Perhaps unknown to many individuals, Konami is also invested in sports and health. In Japan, they have fitness clubs which offer a wide range of classes: soccer, tennis, swimming, gymnastics, and even dancing, just to name a few. Just as the company has a versatile and wide-ranging library of games, their various businesses seem to be equally diverse. Back on the video game side of things, though, Konami was leaving one hell of a mark as it sliced through the decade of the 90s. Castlevania Symphony of the Night released in 1997 to near universal acclaim, breathing new life into a series that, depending on who you ask, had grown stale and oversaturated since the original game released back in the 80s. In 1995 and 1998 respectively, Konami also published Suikoden 1 and 2. Neither game enjoyed Symphony of the Night's critical or commercial success, but each one has gone on to attract a cult following, and in modern times the two games are lauded by many. Arguably though, the biggest game Konami put out in that time frame was Metal Gear Solid. Coming from the mind of Hideo Kojima, a developer who effortlessly doubles as an auteur, the game was a massive hit, and while not the true beginning to the Metal Gear franchise, it's the game that launched the series into stardom. Following protagonist Solid Snake as he infiltrates Alaska's fictional Shadow Moses Island facility, where a new top-secret walking nuclear tank called Metal Gear Rex is being hijacked by terrorists, the game features stealth action gameplay that hadn't been seen yet. Making the experience all the more entertaining is a cheesy but deep story full of twists and turns, and a cast of villains that are some of the most memorable in our medium.
I see that you enjoy Konami games.
While the game was undeniably innovative and highly enjoyable, the most important thing it did was launch creator Hideo Kojima into instant fame. And while it wasn't yet known at the time, this would also be the man who would eventually play a massive part in the downfall of Konami in the eyes of the gaming sphere, a story we'll get to shortly. One unexpected contribution the Japanese publisher made to the games industry during the late 90s was its push into the music rhythm genre. While Konami certainly wasn't the first to make those types of games, it definitely popularized them thanks to the release of Beatmania, a title that caused the entire genre to explode in a way it never had before. Konami was quick to capitalize on its success, and what followed was a ridiculously large number of sequels. This wasn't all they flooded the industry with, as they also created Dance Dance Revolution and its litany of sequels, Guitar Freaks, Drum Mania, Keyboard Mania, and an arcade cabinet called U-Beat, on top of yet even more rhythm games. It's impossible to say with certainty whether dance and rhythm games wouldn't have naturally become massive regardless of who made the first major push, but one thing is for sure, Konami made a substantial impact with them, and it's likely future non-Konami series like Rock Band and Guitar Hero wouldn't have come out when they did, as they did, and to the reception they received, if not for Konami's earlier, bolder moves. As the 2000s were in full swing, Konami continued to push out titles that offered something for everyone. The Metal Gear Solid franchise remained a solid hit, and Hideo Kojima continued to launch what many consider masterpieces. Outside of the stealth action genre, Konami found success with their Pro Evolution Soccer series, countless Yu-Gi-Oh! Games across a wide range of platforms, and they even had a good push into survival horror with the Silent Hill series. Kojima himself championed a second franchise at this time, Zone of the Enders, though it remains somewhat of a footnote to both his history and Konami's. Oh, and Konami did publish the atrocious Bomberman Act Zero, so not all was well and good. Bad games aside, Kogamasa Kazuki must have been feeling pretty confident. Konami's capital was increasing and they'd begun creating new subsidiaries. This was made even better by the fact that the company was listed on the New York Stock Exchange in 2002. Not long after, they debuted a new logo yet again, which is the one they still maintain today. Adding to the company's good fortune and diverse revenue streams were the 2008 Beijing Summer Olympics, where 3 athletes from their gymnastics and swimming teams won medals, something that must have made for good marketing when enticing new patrons to try their sports clubs. Helping even more were the 6 medals Konami-related athletes won in the 2012 London Games. By 2010, the publisher began distributing mobile games. While this may be to the ire of most hardcore players, Konami laughed their way all the way to the bank. With both mobile gaming and pachinko in their portfolio, the company only continued to grow. Even today, where they publish barely any console games, Konami's profits only move upwards. The company is currently enjoying 5 year-on-year reports of revenue growth, even as the publisher/developer barely pays any attention to our beloved hardcore gaming space. On August 12, 2014, Silent Hill's PT demo dropped on the PlayStation Network, and instantly became a cult hit, even for a demo you can't even download today. Fans had been clamoring for a new Silent Hill game, especially after news broke a few years earlier that the team behind the games had been disbanded. So a new one, helmed by the duo of Hideo Kojima and Guillermo del Toro, got people excited. PT itself was a playable teaser for a Silent Hill game that was in the works. Serving as a first-person horror experience, the short demo was quite terrifying, and hype for the full game went through the roof. Yet tragically, less than a year later, the game would be cancelled, the demo would be pulled from the virtual store, and just a few months after that, the long-standing and fruitful relationship between Konami and Hideo Kojima would be in tatters, a rift that would be felt industry-wide. Sadly, as Metal Gear Solid 5 was nearing release, horrific news about the working conditions at Konami began to leak, made worse as this followed rumors and speculation that the long-lasting relationship between the company and Kojima was finally fraying for good. The rumors were fueled when in March of 2015, Konami removed Kojima's name from the Metal Gear website. This followed news of a Konami restructuring that oddly left out Kojima's name. So this move on Konami's end was shocking to say the least. A shock that only multiplied when it was also announced that Kojima Productions LA was being renamed simply to Konami Los Angeles Studio. Towards the end of that same month, it was announced by GameSpot that Kojima would be leaving Konami after Metal Gear Solid 5 launched less than 6 months later. With this news came yet even more drama, as it was also reported that Konami was cracking down hard and limiting communication between those at the studio. Come August of that same year, Kotaku published an article about how Konami was treating its staff like prisoners. Portions of the report indicated that Kojima Productions had been rebranded as simply Number 8 Production Department. Employees were being heavily monitored with cameras watching their every move, and they no longer had permanent company email addresses. Anyone who returned late from lunch would have their names read out loud in an effort to shame them, and game developers who weren't seen as useful were allegedly being reassigned to different jobs altogether, including but not limited to security and cleaning staff. Crazier still was a claim that a former employee had made a post on Facebook about finding a new job, and any current employee who liked the post were reshuffled within the company. After Metal Gear Solid 5 released, Kojima did in fact leave the company, but not before Konami would embarrass itself further. The game released to widespread critical acclaim, where today it still holds a 93 on Metacritic, so naturally it was going to be featured at the upcoming Video Game Awards held on December 3rd. It would go on to win Best Score and Soundtrack and Best Action Adventure Game. Yet, as Jeff Keighley, the host and friend to Hideo Kojima, would express during the show, Konami had forbidden him from coming and receiving the award. An announcement that was booed by the live crowd and lambasted heavily online.
Mr. Kojima had every intention of being with us tonight, but unfortunately he was informed by a lawyer representing Konami just recently that he would not be allowed to travel to tonight's awards ceremony to accept any awards.
Following his departure from Konami, Kojima would go on to found a new studio and begin work on his next game, a PlayStation exclusive called Death Stranding. As for Konami, they began to stray further and further from the types of games that made them so popular during the 80s, 90s, and 2000s. They would ultimately release a new game in the Metal Gear franchise, a zombie survival game that takes place in an alternate dimension. It sold poorly, was hated by most, and the series has been dormant since. As already mentioned, slowing down their production of console and PC games has done little to hinder Konami's momentum. Just take a gander at their newest financial reports if you want proof. The name Konami means little wave in Japanese, which is all the more ironic because at points in its history, Konami has been a tidal wave to be reckoned with. Its lasting mark on the games industry at large is legendary, and their reach is felt the globe over. But like a tide retreating, the events of recent years have set Konami back, and it's still too early to tell in what form they will return, or if they even care. After all, money talks.